sustained campaign of direct action that has been demanding Wall Street banks to stop funding fossil fuels. Alice, who is one of our organizers, will be talking a bit more about the campaign later today. Yes. Oh yeah, no, it's okay. There might be another one here. I'll get one. I'll get you one. Yeah.
Thanks.
I'd like to remind everyone that the talk is being live streamed. So if you don't want to be part of the live stream, just wait until the show is over to ask questions to our panelists. But we don't have a way of cutting anyone out. So just have that in mind. And before I sort of get this started, I just want to make sure I want to go down and sort of have the panelists introduce themselves briefly before I read their bios. And so, Alice, do you want to get started?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Great to have everybody here. My name is Alice Hu. I use she, her pronouns. I organize with New York Communities for Change, and I'm one of the Summer Feed organizers.
Hi, I'm Brad Adams. I'm Executive Director of Climate Rights International, formerly Human Rights Watch. I'm a lawyer, and I don't want to bore you with more.
Osio, my name is Marcello Federico. I'm the divestment organizer at the Indigenous Environmental Network, and yeah, grateful to be here. And I use he, they pronouns. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kumi Naidu, and yesterday I got myself a new job. So I'm the new president of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative.
Hello, I'm Nina Lakhani. I am the senior climate justice reporter for The Guardian. I'm based here in New York.
Great, thank you, Nina. So just to get started too, I want to thank the People's Forum for hosting this talk, and also the three organizations that are presenting it, Climate Rights International, Indigenous Environmental Network, and Summer Heat. So Marcelo, I was just wondering if you can get us started.
Hello, cool. So, thank you everyone for being here. I wanted to start with acknowledging that we are here on unceded Lenape territory, and that we are here because of Indigenous peoples. And I want to have a moment of silence for all of the ancestors and martyrs and victims of imperialism, colonization, genocide. So if you'd like to have a silent prayer, I would just ask for a moment of silence for all those people. Thank you. Despite over 400 years of colonization, Indigenous peoples remain here, and we will stay here as long as possible. And we are not going anywhere. So, thank you so much for your prayers, intentions, your love, and your struggle, and your willingness to fight here. So, on behalf of Indigenous peoples, I am grateful for y'all. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcello. That's wonderful. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge what's happening in Palestine, especially the genocide that's being committed against Palestinian people in Gaza, in the West Bank, and the indiscriminate bombing of civilians in Lebanon. And yes, I want to advocate for the release of all hostages in Gaza and in Israel as well, and acknowledge the horrific large-scale war in Sudan. Conservative estimates say that the conflict has killed like over 15,000 people, but some estimates say that it's close to 150,000. We know very little about what's really happening there. And of course, acknowledge also the victims of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, of Ukraine, and the growing number of victims of climate disaster. A recent report by the World Economic Forum estimates that by the year 2050, there will be close to 15 million deaths caused by climate disaster. I think that we're here because we understand the effects of the extreme weather. We know that heat waves, heavy rain, drought wildfires, coastal flooding will continue to become more common in the coming years. And that's one of the reasons why climate activists are becoming, more forceful and more intentional in their actions. We have a very short window to lower greenhouse gas emissions and to phase out fossil fuels in order to keep our planet around 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. Otherwise, if we don't do that, we might be crossing some serious tipping points and put our planet on an irreversible path to unsustainable warming and chaos. I'm going to quote a climate impact scholar that I like called Johan Rockström, who says, that what remains for us is only 200 billion tons of carbon, to release 200 billion tons of carbon dioxide in order to have a 50% chance of keeping the planet just 1.5 degree warmer than pre-industrial levels. Today, we emit 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. That gives us 5 years to at the current levels, to try to keep our planet around 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it's very likely that we're headed to 2 degrees Celsius. And many scientists and scholars says that there's no plan for a planet that's 4 degrees hotter, that there's no adjusting to that. So I think that this is a serious matter. And climate activists have been really, really effective in terms of pressuring governments and the corporate sector and the fossil fuel industry to take action. And it is because they've been effective that there's so much pressure on them and that they're being criminalized and punished. So I believe this is a very serious conversation that has, very meaningful effects to the future of the climate movement. And I'm glad that these panelists are here to sort of discuss this with us. I want to start by showing a film, a 2-minute video that was produced by Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. It will be live streamed too, so you don't have to leave it, and you can stay there. But, maybe so people can watch it here. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, we can see it.
Connections nourish us. It's what makes us human. They tie us to the land, to the air we breathe. But the climate crisis is threatening the very fabric of life.
Extreme weather, massive floods, temperatures soaring.
Thousands of people have been evacuated.
Thousands of people have been evacuated. And the culprit? Fossil fuels. We know they're poisoning our world. But instead of phasing out fossil fuels, many governments are ramping up. And it's time to quit.
Oil is now flowing through the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion.
Work will begin to extract crude from the Rosebank oil field.
We need an exit ramp off the highway to Clyde.
We need a new plan. We need a fossil fuel treaty. A global call to
stop the expansion of fossil fuels.
Phasing out fossil fuels to adjust the equitable transition.
We've stopped weapons of mass destruction before.
And today, a new historic treaty has been signed.
With a stroke of a pen. And we can do it again. Wealthy nations must move first and fastest. And other nations are already leading the way.
This treaty is imperative and monumental.
We can no longer wait. No hay otro camino.
To face down coal, oil, and gas.
Communities have stepped up, championing a movement all over the world. It's the connections we hold dear and that we're striving to protect that will ultimately save us. After all, we can't help it. It's what makes us human. Protect what you love.
I want to start with you, Kumi. Congratulations on your new job. You can just switch it up. Yeah. Is it working? Okay, great. And I'm wondering if you can just, start the panel by painting us a picture of where the climate movement is right now and where the climate crisis is, and what can a fossil fuel treaty do for that?
Okay, thank you very much, Rodrigo. Good evening, everyone. In 2015, July, I was in Kiribati, the Pacific Island state, and I learned a new, very painful slogan. The slogan was 1.5 to stay alive. 1.5 to stay alive. 6 months later, I was at the Paris climate negotiations, and the same new friends of mine from the Pacific invited me to come and join a protest inside the negotiating space where we got some permission. And I went there and I was going to proudly chant this new slogan that I learned. And as I was about to start, people were waving like this and said, no, the slogan has changed in 6 months. Instead of 1.5 to stay alive, it was 1.5, we might survive, right? So I'm going to just flip it and do a small quiz, if I might, right? I want to pose the question to you, where are we in terms of averting catastrophic climate change? And I want to give you 3 choices. Choice 1, no need to panic. Our governments and business will get their act together and save most of us. Don't laugh. Option 2 is, we are in a deep crisis, but we still have a window of opportunity, and that window of opportunity is closing fast. But we have the capability with courage and resistance to open up that window. And option 3, if you permit me to use a language from my country, which is Afrikaans, one of the languages, I think you'll understand it when I tell you the words though. Option 3 is, ons is deep, deep, deep in the kak. Okay? Okay, it's too late. So let's quickly do that. How many of you think we're option 1? Please raise your hand. Okay. By the way, 10 years ago when I did this, there would be at least like 5%, 10% of people used to put up their hands. Okay, option 2, how many of you think it's bad, but we can turn things around? Okay. And how many of you think that ons is deep, deep in the kak? Okay, so it's almost 50-50. So if I'm very honest with you, there are days when I wake up, it's option 2, and the other days it's option 3, right? But I want to start with that message, right? And that is to say that the moment of history that we find ourselves in, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our lived experiences, and our observations can, must, and should be overturned by our response being where we respond with the optimism of courage, of our thought, our action, our humanity, and our creativity. So I think we are basically between the option 2 and option 3. And that is not a great place to be. And in 1992, when the first climate negotiations took place, George Bush Sr. waved his finger and he said, "The American way of life is non-negotiable." Sorry, I know that was a terrible accent. Right? And basically, I would say the dominant nations of the world have acted with impunity, with arrogance, with a lack of respect for their own citizens, as well as a lack of respect for the citizens of the world. So where we are right now is that when we look at the climate negotiations, which have been happening yearly since 1992, and in 2009, there was one big moment in Copenhagen. I don't know whether the older people might remember Copenhagen. It was like that climate thing. We said we're going to turn things around, and we went there fighting for what we called a fab deal. Not a fabulous deal, but a fair, ambitious, and a binding deal. We didn't get a fab deal at all. What we got was a flab deal, F-L-A-B, full of loopholes and bullshit, right? And basically, if you look at what's been happening in the climate negotiations officially, it's at best incremental baby steps in the right direction. And let me just ask another quiz question. How many of you know when was the first time in any of these negotiations the term fossil fuels was mentioned? Anybody? If you know, don't answer. How many of you know? Put up your hands. 1, 2, 3. It started in 1992, but only 2 years ago, the first time fossil fuels was actually even mentioned, even though fossil fuels are the biggest driver of the crisis that we're in. Why is that the case? The reason is the largest delegation at every climate negotiations is not the United States or the UK, even though their delegations sometimes can be as close to 500 people strong. The largest delegation is the fossil fuel industry and the lobbyists. So the last one had about 4,000, right? So, but I just want to ask you to think about the absurdity of that. That's like Alcoholics Anonymous having their annual global conference, and the largest delegation to the conference is the alcohol industry, right? Because, and so we are struggling to break our addiction on fossil fuels. So just to round up to say that I am not saying, and the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative is not saying that we must forget Paris and ignore the COP. But we have to recognize that there is fundamental limitations by a set of agreements that people have to voluntarily live up to, right? And so the Fossil Fuel Treaty is seen to be a complementary effort to the COPs, so that we actually can move towards a situation where we can have a legally binding treaty where we can hold our governments accountable. My last point is the skeptics in the audience are probably thinking, there are a lot of treaties that are signed after lots of blood, sweat, and tears, such as the landmine treaty, which the United States, China, Russia don't follow, right? They just ignore it, they haven't signed up to it, and so on. So you might say, well, doing all of that and having dominant nations not sign it or sign it and don't implement it is a problem. But this is where our initiative is different. Because see, when you think about compliance, it's about compliance by some international body, some legal process. But the compliance that we need to build is by making sure that the citizens of each country understand what is at stake and to build real constituencies so citizens, hopefully American citizens, will hold whichever American government is in power to account. And that's really what's behind the treaty. And I would conclude by saying, at the moment, we have 13 countries that have signed on and endorsed it. Importantly, 2 countries which are fossil fuel exporters, Colombia, as well as Timor-Leste, used to be known as East Timor. And so, by the way, the treaty does not exist. The idea is to get a critical mass of countries, and then they start working towards an ambitious treaty. And to be honest, it probably is not a good idea to get certain countries involved too early, because because what they'll do is they'll water down the level of ambition. So the countries driving it are small island states and most vulnerable countries, and we hope to come up with an ambitious plan, but to do that in a way that we succeed. I just want to end with a diagnosis, and some of you might get upset with me, right? But we are not good at what we do. We're really not good at what we do. We try hard, and maybe I'll just put it in a very personal story to make the point. On January 2022, my son, who was a very famous rapper and hip-hop artist in South Africa, sits his mom and I down and say, guys, I got to tell you, y'all are really bad at your jobs. Y'all have been fighting for human rights, democracy, sustainability, gender equity, and on since y'all were teenagers, and everything is going in the wrong direction. So why don't you just chill, spend the time you should have spent with us when you were trying to save the world, and spend time with your grandkids. And then when I asked him, so why do you think we are not winning? And he said, it's because y'all think y'all can move people by aiming all your narratives primarily at the brain. Science, facts and figures, policies, degrees, parts per million, and an alphabet soup that people drown in because there's so many acronyms we use in the climate struggle. And he said, y'all aim everything here and you'll ignore the heart, the body, and the soul. And I want to challenge the climate movement, as I do everywhere, unless we develop the capability to communicate to ordinary people. Don't make climate a environmental issue, because climate is about water, it's about air, it's about jobs, it's about livelihoods. And unless we do that better than we're doing it now, we don't stand a chance to turn things around. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumi. Just a quick follow-up question to you, Kumi. You write about the role of civil disobedience in your book, and obviously it played a major role in your fight and the fight against white-controlled government in South Africa. Why are there still people on the left and everywhere saying that civil disobedience doesn't work and that shouldn't be part of our resistance movement? Do you have an assessment on that? Like, and can you talk about civil disobedience?
So firstly, that's a very incorrect reading of history. If we look at every struggle, every injustice that humanity faced, those struggles only moved forward when decent women and men stood up and said, enough is enough and no more. We're prepared to put our lives on the line. We're prepared to go to prison if necessary, and so on. Now, just to, especially to the younger people in the audience, just to let you know that the struggle for justice is not a popularity competition. If you want to be in the struggle, you need to recognize that you're going against the status quo. You're going against the energy system, the economic system, the transport system, the food system, and the people who control those systems and who are making billions of dollars every year out of it. They're going to fight us tooth and nail as they are doing, okay? But don't worry, even if you're unpopular today, if we win the struggle and avert catastrophic, irreversible, runaway climate change, history will judge you just like how Martin Luther King is judged today, right? 41 times in prison, vilified at the, at the time of his work, and now there's a statue, a monument in Washington, D.C. as prominent as George Washington or anybody else's. Nelson Mandela, 27 years in prison, vilified, comes out, and then every government in the world wanted him to come and address their parliament and get some of his saintly vibe from him, right? I can run the list, Rosa Parks, Gandhi, and thousands of other people. So I am unapologetic about saying that civil disobedience is a legitimate expression of our sense of citizenship. It is the highest act of patriotism. When there is an injustice, we have a right and responsibility to stand up against it. However, civil disobedience, like anything else in the activist toolbox, if used unstrategically, can backfire. And we should not do civil disobedience just for the sake of doing civil disobedience, right? Let me give you an example. So maybe here in New York or in San Francisco, where I'm based at the moment, where I'm a visiting lecturer at Stanford. Do you know what's mooning? Everybody knows what's mooning? Okay, mooning is, say, if all of us got together and we wrote 2 letters on our bum cheeks, like stop climate change, and then we stand in a line and then we pull down our pants and then we show our bums and it reads stop climate change. Now that might be a wonderful civil disobedience action to do in New York or San Francisco, but probably is not going to be so good in Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Indonesia, for example. So we need to understand that civil disobedience, like everything else, is fundamentally contextual, right? We really need to understand where people are. And if civil disobedience is done with fun, right? I'll just give an example. Right now in East Africa, they're trying to build a massive crude oil pipeline, right? And we did a demonstration at the AGM of the bank, Standard Bank. And it was very peaceful, and we actually didn't plan to get arrested or thrown out. But sometimes you get gifts. And sometimes as an activist, when you do civil disobedience, the worst thing that can happen to you is you make all the effort and they don't arrest you. Because if they don't arrest you, it's as if nothing happened. But thankfully, in this particular protest, which happened less than a year ago, 4 burly white men, security guys at this bank, go after this young kid who was the organizer, and then to throw him out, and I go there and I say, what are you doing? Everything's peaceful. And then they say, no, we've been telling him to stop for 3 hours and he hasn't taken you all out. And then I said, okay, if you're throwing him out, you'll throw me out, right? And they didn't know anything about my background and so on, so they chucked me out. The photograph and the video of 4 big guys carrying me out of this AGM went viral, so much so that the security guys, I understand it from good intelligence, they almost lost their jobs, because apparently they asked, don't you know who this guy is? He's like the former head of Greenpeace and so on. And one of the guys said, we thought he was a random old Indian guy. Right? So I go in a little bit of a story there, and I want to end with this, to say that we must understand that historically, all struggles have benefited from civil disobedience being partnered with what today we call artivism, bringing arts, culture, and activism together. Right? In the anti-apartheid struggle, for example, we wouldn't have stood a chance to win when the government made sure that the majority of our people couldn't read and write by depriving our people of education. So we had to use song, dance, theater, and so on. And let me just end with this point, related to your first question. We must not underestimate what our children are going through. There are girls all over the planet that I meet in my work who are teenagers who are asking me, so Kumi, it's probably not a good thing for us to think about having kids given the climate crisis. How horrific it is for my generation that we put young people in that situation. And I didn't mention this, but my son, 6 weeks after that conversation, committed suicide. And when he called me the conversation before, he said, the last conversation I had with him, he was saying, you know, your generation went through horrific times. We're burying your activist friends every other weekend and so on. But you all add something that we don't have. Anybody knows what? Sorry, somebody said it. Hope that things would get better. And we have to make sure that we prosecute all the elements of activism in a way that it's promoting love, generating community, building networks where people can support each other and so on. And I say to you, we ignore that at our peril. We have to understand that we are facing a massive global mental health crisis as a result of the climate crisis as well as the rise of fascism and inequality, and we should not ignore it. And so especially those of our generation who got lots of gray hair, we need to be nurturing and supporting young people and giving them some measure of comfort and support. But the most important thing we could do with young people is to allow them to lead. And to the young people here, I conclude by saying to you, when anybody in my generation says, young people are the leaders of tomorrow, push back against it. Because if you wait for tomorrow, there might not be a tomorrow for you to take leadership in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kumi. I'd like to show now a 10-minute film produced by Climate Rights International based on their report on thin ice. Let's take a look.
Hello, it's Morgan. I'm a civil engineer from London. As part of Just Stop Oil, I'm occupying the QE2 bridge. We just survived the first night up here. We're up here until the government makes a meaningful statement to cancel all new licenses and consents for oil and gas extraction, because oil and gas is killing us now and it's driving millions into poverty.
It needs to be done because we act on behalf of life.
Morgan Troland and Marcus Decker climbed the Queen Elizabeth II Bridge outside London to raise awareness about climate change. For 36 hours, they stayed on top of the bridge. For their peaceful protest, Troland served 14 months in prison and Decker spent over 16, the longest sentences ever for a peaceful protest in the United Kingdom. Decker, a German national, is now being threatened with deportation. The United Kingdom is not the only government responding harshly to climate protesters. Many democratic governments in the global north are passing harsh new laws which restrict the fundamental right to peaceful protest and imposing heavy penalties, including prison.
In Germany, which considers itself a strong democracy, a very free country, we're seeing increasing charges against climate activists who are part of peaceful civil disobedience actions. I would say it's one of the most terrifying effects that we're seeing worldwide as a climate crisis demands us to act drastically, radically, and promptly. We see governments being busy bullying climate activists.
The name Letzte Generation, which is the name of the group I belong to, translates to last generation. This name is derived from a Barack Obama quote, which was, I think, in 2015. We are the first generation to feel the effect of climate change and the last generation who can do something about it. Maybe the most dramatic response from German authorities to the peaceful protests of Letzte Generation have been house raids on the accusation that these people were a criminal organization.
To me, climate activists are like the canaries in the coal mines. We're not protesting for fun. We're not protesting to gain on a personal level anything except a livable future.
The escalating impacts of the climate crisis and frustration with governmental inaction are fueling protests. Climate protesters in many Western democracies are resorting to the kinds of peaceful civil disobedience used by the civil rights and similar movements.
This is no longer action against climate activists, this is action against democracies and the freedom of the people.
The way the authorities are looking at us is basically as a problem to get rid of.
They're hoping with enough repression we'll give up and we won't get any building of the movement.
Many of these countries suppressing these protests have repeatedly pushed other, more repressive governments to allow protests. This is because they know that the right to protest plays a vital role in democracies. Protests allow individuals to advocate for change, hold companies and governments accountable for their climate commitments, and engage in public affairs to drive sustainable solutions. Yet just when they should be welcoming public concern about the existential threat of climate change, they are acting like the autocrats they criticize.
Somewhere at the end of January 2023, I got arrested with 7 other Dutch citizens who are very much worried about the climate crisis. And that was because we posted online that we were gonna protest against fossil subsidies in Holland.
Sloot and his fellow activists were detained before the protest and later convicted of the felony of sedition for inciting others to commit a criminal offense. Other climate activists have been held in preventative detention to stop them from attending protests.
I was detained and brought to jail in September 2023. We were about 45 people arrested out of these hundreds who had been protesting in the state of Bavaria. The judge, he asked me if I was going to continue doing these protests, and as we affirmed that, we were sent to jail for the next 10 days.
At a certain point, I realized that nonviolent civil disobedience was what was going to raise the necessary level of awareness about the climate crisis.
Peaceful civil disobedience, which involves an act of deliberate lawbreaking, is recognized as a form of exercising the rights of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly under international human rights law. Any punishment should be proportionate.
Our version of climate protest is to disrupt the public, to call the public into the conversation.
We went into the museum with washable nursery school finger paint, and we approached the little dancer in her protective box, which no other children in the world have. And it was never our intention to cause any harm. There is a difference between creating the appearance of damage and actually damaging and injuring things. My hands looked bloody and Tim's were black for dripping oil.
Hello, friends.
And what these actions do is wake people up. It's designed to engage the public in their emotional centers.
We need our leaders to take serious action to tell us the truth about what is happening with the climate. And then we were arrested, as we were expecting to be. The first charge was conspiracy against the United States of America. The second was a felony damage charge for injuring a National Gallery exhibit.
We're just doing this for our children.
Each of those charges have a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison and a monetary fine of up to $500,000.
Take climate action now.
The conspiracy charge equated me with the January 6th insurrectionists who stormed the Capitol, trying to overthrow our government violently with weapons and massive destruction. And what I did that day at the National Gallery is completely nonviolent for the common good, which is what civil disobedience is.
Joanna made a plea deal due to a debilitating health condition and was sentenced to 2 months in a federal facility. Tim Martin is waiting to go to trial. Some climate protesters face restrictions on how they defend themselves against criminal charges. In some courts, climate protesters are being prohibited from discussing the motivations behind their actions, undermining their right to a fair trial. Instead of prosecuting protesters, government should see climate protesters and activists as allies. After all, they have been more successful than governments in raising awareness about this existential challenge.
The fact is that climate activism is not something you're born into, but it's something you stand up to do no matter where you are in your life. And I would say, from all the years of activism and for all the thousands of people I've spoken with, the one really most powerful answer to desperation is action.
Thank you. So, Brad, you you are the founder of Climate Rights International and also its executive director. Before that, from 2002 to 2022, you were the head of Human Rights Watch Asia Division, the executive director, right? Can you talk about what you've seen throughout this now, like 24 years, and what are the findings, the most important findings of this report? And also, your experience working in Asia and now sort of doing this report, focus on Western democracies. Like, what have you seen? What's changed?
Thank you. So when I used to work at Human Rights Watch, and when I first conceived this project, I put it under the category of Hypocrisy Watch, because I've spent years encouraging Western governments and democracies to raise concerns about restrictions on fundamental freedoms in other countries. And they actually do it much less than they should. And they often do it only against certain countries that they don't have particularly strong financial or geopolitical relationships with. And they should do more of it. So I'm never going to criticize them for doing it, except now they're doing the same thing to their own citizens that they criticize other countries for. And it seemed important to us as we watched more and more people in Western democracies, and yes, air quotes, because there's lots of questions about just how democratic many of these states are, including the one we're in right now, and seeing them basically create a trend of more and more repressive laws against climate activists and harsher implementation of those laws. So a lot of laws that were sort of lying around in the books are now being used against climate activists in ways that they wouldn't have been before. And countries, and we sort of singled out the UK as the leading country for this under the previous government, for passing new laws because, as Kumi was saying, activism often disrupts lives. So if you know London, the M25, the circular highway around London, has been blocked various times by Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion. What you saw at the beginning of the video was people blocking a bridge that's used a lot on work days. And of course, people are pissed off. They're late for work, they're disrupted, and yet we all also know that that kind of disruption sometimes is necessary. So whether you agree with the tactics or not, we hope that you will agree that what we said in those last panels is true, that these are basic rights that need to be protected, whether it's in Cambodia, where I used to work, or Bangladesh, where I just was, where Western governments are very full-throated in their condemnation of crackdowns on protests, or here. I do have to make a correction. I hate being wrong when we make films, but we were wrong about one thing at the beginning. We said that the 14 and 16-month sentences against the protesters were the worst in British history. Actually, there have now recently been sentences of 5 years of a very well-known leader of the climate movement in the UK, Roger Hallam. He got 5 years for participating in a Zoom conversation once to plan a protest action that would lead to the blocking of roads, and 4 other people who participated at various levels in planning that action got 4 years in prison. Non-violent protests, 5 years for one person, 4 for another. If Xi Jinping did that in China, or the Vietnamese Communist Party did that, there would be a very loud press release from the State Department, possibly even from the British Foreign Office, which is actually not quite as full-throated in defending basic rights around the world. This is really, really shocking and appalling. And I just want to give you a little bit more context for Joanna Smith, who we saw in the film, about her situation. She should be here tonight. She lives in Brooklyn. She would have probably loved to have joined us. But she's, let me pull up so she pled guilty before U.S. District Judge Amy Berman Jackson. And I think it's important to say the names of these people, because if you're a federal judge, you have lots of discretion. You can decide how you handle these cases. But she pled guilty to 1 count of causing injury to a National Gallery of Art exhibit. She was sentenced to 60 days in prison. In addition to the prison term, she was ordered to serve 24 months of supervised release. So for what you saw, washable finger paint, very symbolic protest, which could have been washed off in 10 minutes, I'm sure. She has to serve 150 hours of community service, 10 of which must involve cleaning graffiti, and pay restitution for the damage, which they calculated at $4,000. So good work if you can get it for $4,000. She's also barred from entering DC and all museums and monuments for 2 years. And she didn't come here because she may have needed permission from her parole officer to come to an event like this in case there was another climate felon here. Because if she's in the presence of a climate felon, she could be returned to prison. Did I get that right? Here's what this federal judge said about what we just saw. It was narcissistic, not altruistic. It got no point across. No one who saw the picture in court today delivered meaning from it. That taught a lesson about the future of the planet. But I can assure the family and the public that you will be judged and you will be sentenced for the reality of the act. And the reality is that this was actual vandalism. Ordinary, pointless, self-indulgent, reckless vandalism. Reckless vandalism, the federal judge said. Use the term civil disobedience, and many of the other letter writers do, letter writers being people who wrote letters on her behalf. And it's intoned like a mantra in many of the letters, but you flatter yourself. There's a marked difference between the peaceful violation of an unjust law, which as Dr. King and Henry David Thoreau pointed out, is necessarily coupled with the willful suffering of the necessary consequences, a showing of actual fidelity to law to bring about a change in that law. All right, I could go on. The state, in the form of this judge and the laws that are being executed and the prosecutors who brought the case and the police who arrested and filed the report, is choosing to come down as hard as they can on climate protesters. We can all speculate why. You know, my personal belief is that the fossil fuel industry has just a little bit to do with that, and the way that we, you know, our campaign finance laws are, you know, permissive and invite outside interference. But who knows? Maybe this is just a judge who just doesn't understand where she stands in history, because she had the gall to cite Martin Luther King as a positive example and then say that this act was somehow an act of extreme vandalism. I want to do one little sort of explain why we created Climate Rights International and what we're trying to do, but I'll do that because I have my own thought experiment, following yours. Do me a favor, close your eyes, and I think Nate's heard this before, but maybe others haven't. Close your eyes and think of climate change, and for the next 10 seconds, develop a mental picture of what you're thinking of for climate change. Okay, thanks. How many of you thought of a tree? How many of you thought of a polar bear? How many of you thought of an ice floe? How many of you thought of your children? How many of you thought of a person other than your children? Oh, you guys are all liars. So I've never had more than 5% raise their hands about. Good, so you are the right audience, and you need now become evangelists, because the reason that we started this organization is because we are not paying enough attention to people as the purpose of our activism on climate change. It has mostly been an environmental movement. The environmental movement has clearly not been able to move people far enough. It's not their fault, but the fact is that this is a people problem, and we need to popularize the fact that it's a people problem. I'm so happy. So it's obviously we've been very successful at CRI, which none of you ever heard of probably until this week, in getting that picture into your brain, and then you all raised your hands. It's the first time I've had almost anybody raise their hands. And if we don't make this a conversation about people, about instead of just about planet, because this truism, which is the planet will be fine 10,000 years from now when we're all dead, it will regenerate, there'll be trees, whatever age we're in. It'll be fine. That's not, the planet is is an important thing in and of itself, but it's actually people that should be at the center of this. And we need to bring all, 90% of the people who are in New York this week for Climate Week are here to talk about mitigation, about the latest fintech, the latest technical solutions, the carbon capture and sequestration. There are charts about, all that's fine, except it's disconnected from, I think, what the reality is, which is that if we don't do something about it, if we don't make people the center of it, all of that will come to nothing. And the best example of that is, right now, if you could propose a perfect technical solution to the climate crisis to the US Congress, it would not pass. The US Congress would reject it. on ideological grounds. So our view is like, whether you think that particular action was good or bad, whether you think blocking roads is good or bad, whatever form of, whatever you view, Kumi said, we have to do it with joy, and I don't think any of us can say what's good or bad. Our view is that people should have the right to express themselves, and it's absolutely necessary, and there's no chance we're going to win the climate fight unless people are allowed to express themselves and to raise their concerns in their own ways. And some of us will think some of these things they do, like spraying stuff over Stonehenge, maybe that's counterproductive, and that's my view. But other people think, no, that's what's necessary. But it's fundamental, and as Luisa said, and I'll just finish here, this is no longer just an assault on climate activism, it's an assault on democracy. And you can be sure if we don't keep our democratic freedoms, we will not win this fight on climate change.
Thank you, Brad. I want to move to Nina now. Nina, you're the senior climate justice reporter for The Guardian right now. I want to briefly read your bio. You have reported from more than a dozen countries, including 7 years freelancing across Mexico and Central America, and 6 years as a staff reporter in London with independent newspapers. I want to highlight a story that you wrote in 2003, I believe, last year, August 2003. It's a fascinating story about a group of indigenous defenders opposing a mining project in Guatemala. That works. Thank you, guys. You've been so kind. I really didn't think through this, but anyway, they're a good sport. According to your reporting, that case, which dates back to the early 2000s, I think, set the standards for how governments can criminalize and threaten indigenous and social movements opposing extractivist projects. I'm wondering if you can talk about that story and why that case, has had such an influence and ripple effects throughout the world.
So I moved to Mexico in early 2013, and I was based there, but then reporting across Central America and Mexico. And when I started going to Guatemala to report, a lot of the stories I was sort of working on were about extractive industries, battles for land, for natural resources, and they were very mining focused, mostly Canadian mines. And there was a lot of, but people kept talking to me about the Marlin mine, and I actually never got to go there when I was sort of based there. But I heard about the Marlin mine for years, and so when I went last year, and so this is one of the first documented cases that we know, not necessarily one among the very first, where criminalization was used against community leaders. And in this case, this was an indigenous community where a Canadian company had gone in to mine gold, had sort of divided and conquered the community to start with. So there was a lot of people in favor of it. They got jobs, etc. And then as the reality set in, people's economic situations did not change. Their water became incredibly polluted. Land started to destabilize. The houses started falling down, etc. People stood up against the mine. And back in 2007, 2008, this was about 15 indigenous people, men and women, were charged on trumped-up charges, right? And they were put in jail. The impact of that was devastating. That the aim of it was to stigmatize, to destabilize, to divide, to neutralize a rising social movement, right? And they did that. It was really effective. When I went, so this is, I went last year, it was 16 years later. I spoke to a number of the women who were charged at the time, and they were, I speak Spanish. Many of them don't speak Spanish. They speak Mam, and so we're talking through a translator, and they were weeping at the impact that it had on their life of being considered to be bad women. That impact was, it continues today. It split the whole community, but it was so effective that what you saw was that same tactic of criminalizing was then rolled out in other parts of Guatemala, where other communities were rising up against extractive industries, and then in Mesoamerica, in neighboring countries, then in other parts of Latin America, and it spread. And you can really root those tactics, those strategies, which were the industry, in this case a mine, the Canadian embassy, to the Canadian government and the Guatemalan at a local level and at a national level, right? Because in some of these cases, you had states of exception, states of emergency. You know, there was all sorts of tactics. So, you know, coming back to what Kumi was saying, the fossil fuel industry can only act like it can act, only does what it does because our governments enable them to do that, right? They can't do it on there. They're not coming in and forcing themselves on us. We're allowing them to do that. And so what you saw was this sort of spread. We're about to publish this, I was saying to, you know, I was hoping it was today. We're about to publish this big investigation on the criminalization on the spread of anti-protest laws in the US, which will happen this week. And I was talking to a climate defender, like an attorney, who's representing more than 50 people who have been charged in the Mountain Valley Pipeline case, right? And he was telling me about these charges in Virginia, where people have been who were blocking a road, an access road, have been charged with abduction and conspiracy. And he was telling that to me, and I was like, they started doing that in Guatemala. That is where that started, you know. And what I know, absolutely, we have reported on this. I've been reporting on this type of stuff for years. That states learn from each other and the companies learn from each other. This isn't by coincidence that it's suddenly come to the US. This is because countries like the US and Canada and the UK enabled and allowed this to happen in countries like in Guatemala and Chile and Honduras, right? And so there is a direct connection between what we see happening today in the UK and in the US of what's been happening in, you know, criminalization was being highlighted by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights years ago as and you know what it is, in my view, is a terror tactic. Is absolutely a terror tactic, right? Because and the aim of it is to weaken, to destabilize, to divide and conquer, to silence, to instill fear in people, in individuals and in communities, right? And to weaken movements. And these are the same tactics for those of us that are quite old. This is counterinsurgency. This is exactly the same playbook as counterinsurgency adapted to extractive industries now, right? And so it is so connected. Mary Lawler, who is the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights Defenders, I've spoken to a lot about this, and she talks about these examples. I think the law that's being used in a number of places now where, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's so being part of a foreign NGO can be a crime, right? You probably know the legalities of this better. But the first country to do that was Eritrea. And it worked so well, but it's now been adopted across the world. So countries and companies learn from each other. And that, going back to Guatemala to report that, was really, I really wanted to sort of be able to sort of connect those dots and say that what's happening in Vietnam or South Africa or the US, Minnesota or whatever, these are all connected. They are, and as journalists, we often report, The Guardian is very, very good at reporting on individual cases and particular movements, but we really tried from last year to start connecting those dots, right? Because these are not isolated cases, and unless we start connecting the dots and showing the patterns, they're treated as one-off battles or one-off sort of acts. They're treated as isolated cases of injustice, right? You know, the case of the Extinction Rebellion guys being put in prison for 5 years for attending a Zoom call, right? That couldn't happen without what happened in Guatemala. These are directly connected, and because impunity breeds crime, right? And that is what these are. These are state-sponsored terror tactics, which you know, in states enabling, either directly or indirectly, enabling extractive industries and their shareholders and their investors and their allies to commit. And, you know, it's deep in, and I think we have to think about these things sort of globally.
Thank you, Nina. That's excellent. I also want to read a passage for another article that I think you wrote with two other colleagues. I keep doing that. That's in the US, 21 states have passed critical infrastructure protection laws since the Standing Rock protest, and dozens of activists have been arrested and or charged in the past 5 years. Many of the states' legislation shares language drafted by the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, a right-wing group funded by fossil fuel companies. This is well known and it's not hidden. It's being done in front of our very eyes. Can you talk about the connections between right-wing groups and legislation and the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah.
It's a huge topic, I know, but I wonder if you can say a couple of things.
Yeah, again, I wish we'd published today. We've got much more coming on this on Thursday, so look out for this. Yeah, so there's now 22 states that have passed critical infrastructure protection laws. They are basically, and in some states, so which basically ban protest, and so, they're very broad. They include things like defacing, damaging, impeding, sort of the activities in so-called critical infrastructure. That's all gas, oil, infrastructures, pipelines, all of that sort of stuff. Imprisonable by up to 20 years in some states, right? And I've said dozens in that. We're talking about hundreds now. Just after the Mountain Valley Pipeline was pushed through by our best ever climate president, Joe Biden, 50 people were arrested and charged in Virginia and West Virginia just last year. And what you see is these right-wing groups. So ALEC basically brings together lawmakers, mostly at a state level, with fossil fuel industry sort of like lobbyists, right? And so what you see is, they started in the US, but you see this all over the world, and they're not just working on fossil fuels, reproductive rights, voting rights, gun laws, all of those things, right? You think of them as a sort of, without the ALEC, you probably wouldn't have the Heritage Foundation. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of, they're very much of that ilk. And they're very open about it. So in this case, they basically, they saw the power of the Indigenous-led Standing Rock movement, right? And it was a response to that. It was a response to that. So there's 22 states now that have passed, but there's been many more that have tried and will keep trying. In some places like Florida, for example, if there is a big protest, could be climate, could be BLM, whatever, and a car goes into that crowd and injures somebody, they can't be prosecuted. It's self-defense under Florida state law now. So, this is absolutely a democracy issue. This isn't just a climate issue. It's not an environment issue. These two pieces that we're publishing this week, we have framed them as a right to a democracy issue, right? Because, and I think, this isn't an environment. I think you're absolutely right. When I joined, I'm not a climate expert at all. I became a climate justice reporter 3 years ago. I come from a injustice background. And I remember my first conversation with the UK environment team, which is, this award-winning environment reporting team at The Guardian. And I said to them, I was like, when you all write, like in headlines and in intros, 1.5, it doesn't sound that bad. Do you know what I mean? Like for most people, 1.5 doesn't sound that bad, right? It's like, your temperature moves up and down 10 degrees every day. Do you know what I mean? It's like, that isn't doing what you think you think it's doing. Like for an ordinary person, it just doesn't sound that bad, right? And they were like, what? And I'm like, it doesn't, And it's like, actually, my question in every story that I write is, why does it matter? Why does it matter? Why does any of it matter? Why does the science matter? Why do these laws matter? And I think, in this, why does these model bills that ALEC is spreading around, spreading around the country and having lawmakers take up matter? Because it's in somewhere like, I don't know, somewhere like, say, Montana, I'm picking on Montana, or Utah, where really this, all of the sort of, organs of power are controlled by the Republican Party. The one thing that you have is protest and civil disobedience in order to be able to draw attention. It's a Democrat. It's an act of resistance. It's an act of your democratic right. And if that is taken away because you can go to prison for 5 years, that is a problem for us all, because it is a creep thing, right? And so, like I say, we wouldn't be here today if the world had stood up and said, putting in prison 15 Indigenous Guatemalans for standing up against a mine that was poisoning their water and making their kids have these horrific skin conditions. If we stood up against that, we wouldn't be here today.
Thank you, Nina. Just one more quick question. You did an excellent interview once with Climate Coverage Now, which I think it's an organization that is in the intersection of journalism and climate. And I think in that interview, you said that the UN and sort of the powers that be don't use words like reparation, for instance, but that is a word. There are concepts that you think matter. That when you talk to activists, you learn and you can see that those things matter to them, and that was important for you to sort of to use those words and to sort of reflect that other reality that's not the reality of the UN meetings and the powers that be. Can you talk about that? Like what, and is it difficult for you to sort of introduce words like that, like reparations, that aren't at all being discussed, at the UN or in certain corridors of power?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was definitely a debate with my colleagues. I have I don't know if it's a privilege or a misfortune of going to COP, and it feels like a misfortune most of the time. But I mean, reparations isn't a word that the developed countries who are mostly responsible for the climate crisis want to be used. They don't want it. They don't want it in the process. It's not part of the process. And so, what a lot of journalists, including we, do is we don't use it, right? Because it's sort of like, but we're not part of the process. We're not part of that process. We're there. If people are calling for reparations, we need to ask them why, and we need to. And then we also need to talk to the people who say it's unhelpful to talk about reparations, right? That's what we're here to do. And, we're talking about deep injustices that are being knowingly committed, right, against people and communities. That's what we're doing when we're extracting these fossil fuels, for whether you live in in Cancer Valley in Louisiana or on the, in all the land that has been stolen and polluted in so much indigenous territory in this country and many other countries, right? And, I go around the country reporting on the impact of the climate crisis, on extreme heat, on drought, on floods, and a lot of these damages are irreversible, right? And so people have a right to demand reparations for that, and I think it's our responsibility as journalists to share that, right? To share those demands, to interrogate them, right? For sure. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I think that's part of my job.
Great.
Rodrigo, let me. I just want to add, just so that people understand, why do we use the term loss and damage? And it's because the United States rejected the idea that we would use the term liability instead of loss and compensation instead of damage. And that was a decision made by the United States at the highest level. And that's because the US and plenty of other countries didn't want to accept that they actually would have legal responsibility for the damage that they've caused. So loss and damage, just remember, every time you read it, it's a euphemism. It's softer language than liability and compensation. It's much softer language than reparations. But it's intentional that we use this term that doesn't really signify responsibility.
Rodrigo? So I just wanted to pick up on the point that Nina made about they learn from each other. I'm convinced that when Trump was in office, Trump, Orban, Putin, Modi, Bolsonaro, AMLO, all the good ones. Add a same WhatsApp group moderated by the Crown Prince of Saudi. Okay, no, that's absolutely. This is such an important point, and even though our focus today is more on the global north in a way in democracies, I just wanted to just say something about the south here, right? And I just want to say, when we say global south, global north, how many of you know what percentage of the world's population lives in the global south? You can shout out to your guess. Just shout out 80, going, any more? 70, anybody else? 88, well, he's my friend Mike Fleisch from Global Commons Alliance. And we discussed it a few days ago. So think about that. 88% of the world's population lives in the global south. And when we think about, and I'm going to say something painful here, even our international NGOs, two of which I worked for, and you look at where power sits in those organizations, it doesn't reflect that 88% of people in the global south have influence. So, and then I know the focus here is on repression of activists, right? But I just want to raise the point that we should be careful to not forget two other pieces of the repression at the moment. So one is a statistic from Global Witness. Okay, this admittedly is in the global south, where about 10 years ago, Global Witness told us that on average, every week, 2 environmental activists were getting killed. Just think about that. Every week, on average, when you average it out, 2. Now, it is 4. At the moment, in the last 3 years, it's 4 environmental activists getting killed. So I don't want to do a sort of moral equivalency of how bad things are in Global South, but if Nina is right, that they learn from each other, right? They learn from each other. Don't assume that in so-called Western democracies, you're not going to see at some point, as the contradictions get tighter, that you'll see that. And then the other aspect of the thing that is not talked about, which we learned from the Standing Rock Sioux struggle and the inspirational battle that they fought, which inspired all of us across the world. Right now, as we sit, the company in question, Energy Transfer, right, has brought a $300 million lawsuit against Greenpeace, what is called a SLAP suit, strategic litigation or strategic lawsuit against public participation. And this is being used massively all across the world right now, and in the United States. And does Energy Transfers need $300 million? That's like small change for them. The purpose is to shut down resistance and make it really hard. Rodrigo, I might need to slip out. I've got another speaking engagement. However, I want to end with one practical recommendation. And that is, why don't this meeting here, right, and the people that are the good people that are involved here, set one practical objective, which is, don't do it before the elections, right? But whether Kamala wins or whether Orange Man comes back, just wait, but be ready on the day after the election, mobilize a diverse, high-level priests, industry leaders who are progressive, foundation leaders and so on, and go see Biden and say to him, he must pardon every single climate activist that is in prison in the United States right now. And failure to do that actually makes him as culpable as all the other presidents in terms of stopping climate action. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimo. Marcello, I need to hear from you now, because it must be very interesting to hear this conversation, because Indigenous communities have long been criminalized and oppressed for their activism, their resistance. This isn't new at all. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, your perspective on this, and then how your work in food sovereignty also informs or grounds your resistance and your activism.
Thank you, Rodrigo. So I want to start off by saying that Indigenous peoples make up about 5% of the population and protect about 80% of the world's biodiversity and land and resources. And so with that being said, I want to start by uplifting one of the struggles in New Caledonia that's happening right now under the French imperialist imposition. And today actually celebrates the 171st anniversary of what they call Citizenship Day, which is when France initially colonized New Caledonia. And so this is a Pacific archipelago that has indigenous peoples that go by the Kanak, and they have been violently oppressed for about 4 months now, longer, of course, over decades, but particularly right now because Macron in France has decided that he wants to ram through some constitutional changes to the voting lists of settlers in New Caledonia, and so that has caused a huge outrage among indigenous peoples, because that then pushes them out of their majority, and it brings in this settler colonial perspective that will oust and remove their presence, essentially. And so because of this, there has been over 3,000 arrests in the last few months, and over a dozen people have been killed, primarily indigenous peoples. And so in this struggle, you know, it brings about a very long struggle for independence and excuse me, sorry. And it is a climate-related issue because of the self-determination of these indigenous peoples who are protecting this land and are, who have responsibility to protect this land from our ancestors. And so, that kind of struggle is something that is still ongoing and brings a lot of indigenous peoples together in solidarity. And so things like that are partly what I think is important to look at when looking at climate change, because indigenous peoples, as I mentioned, are so critical to the protection of the biodiversity of the world. And another specific instance of indigenous peoples being repressed is in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where there is currently an attempt by the right-wing coalition to reinterpret the Treaty of Waitangi, I believe it's called. Waitangi, thank you. And in this reinterpretation that is meant to change the special status of indigenous people's rights to an ordinary status of rights, which would essentially remove the Maori people from their indigenous representation in their government. And so IEN works in a way that wants to uplift these struggles and uplift indigenous peoples. And so we have a few of our staff that are collaborating with Maori folk and people of Aotearoa, and this kind of repression is something that, as our other panelists have mentioned, is going to be looked at by other states and copied. And so when you have a government like in New Zealand essentially removing the representation of indigenous peoples, other governments will look at that and say, how can we mimic that and copy it so that we don't have indigenous peoples getting in the way of our profits, like we did in many instances, Standing Rock particularly. And so I want to bring the Article 6 of the oh my goodness, the Conference of Organizing Parties, because sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm a little nervous. I'm going a little bit further away. Sorry. That was something I was going to bring up later, I think. My apologies.
That's great.
One of the other struggles that I hear about from some of my indigenous comrades and relatives comes from Ecuador, particularly because a few years ago there was a landmark lawsuit that Alex Lucetante, I think is pronounced, he was fighting the government and mining corporations for essentially the rights of nature, not explicitly, but he was fighting the mining corporations from giving them the rights to extract resources from his territory, and he won. However, that process of extraction has continued, and people have been disappeared on a weekly basis, as has been mentioned. And so those indigenous peoples are still struggling and are actively in a violent, repressive dynamic between their government, the state, which is also in collaboration with the police, and these illegal mining companies, because they know that they are also going to profit from these very practices. And so indigenous peoples in the Global South are particularly at risk because the lack of infrastructure and support that exists on a governmental basis to enforce these rights of Indigenous peoples, and the rights of Indigenous peoples are actively being rolled back and removed and repealed in numerous countries, including, as I'm sure all of you know, in Palestine, occupied Palestine, and proper Israel, and that specific instance is obviously much more exacerbated. Another instance that I wanted to bring up about Indigenous peoples and the perspective of repression is in so-called Canada of the Wet'suwet'en people and their camp and their series of checkpoints that, according to one of the chief's daughters, Sladu, I believe, is in the way of Canada's largest fracking project. And so they have been met with extreme violent repression from the RCMP and are still in the struggle for the Wet'suwet'en territory and the river that supports their lifeways being contaminated, because the fracking project would decimate their source of water and resources and fish and food and berries. And obviously the man camps also are another symptom of that very repressive system that put women, femmes, and two-spirits at higher risk of sexual assault and trafficking. And so, the people, the indigenous peoples of the world are in constant struggle with their governments trying to take their resources away, because the governments know that we are on the front lines, and because our ancestors are the ones who resisted their attempt at colonizing and stealing our resources. And so they know that if they can get rid of us, then they have a much easier chance of continuing that practice of colonization and genocide. And so the last point that I will make on the point of Rodrigo mentioning my perspective on food sovereignty, you know, I want to mention that the temperature that would cause global crop failures, if I'm correct, is, I believe, 2 degrees Celsius, which doesn't sound like a lot, right? It doesn't seem like there's much there. But when we all can't eat, that becomes a huge problem. And we're already seeing global points of crop failure in numerous countries across Africa and the East. And even here, we have, you know, states that are so dry and or so wet that the climate extremes are preventing us from having a successful crop harvest. And as a former farmer myself, farm manager, I can certainly attest to that. Over the years, there has been very varied climate extremes, from dryness to wetness to snow, what have you, heat, cold. And so one of the things that I really want to focus on in my work is uplifting people's self-determination and autonomy and their abilities to grow their own food and have their own spiritual practice to ground themselves, so that when we do this kind of work, we have the fuel we need and we have the spiritual courage and bravery that we need to continue to stand up to these repressive governments and, yeah, fight for what we know is right.
You were great. I wanted to just make one point connecting the things that you said, but just obviously 1.5 is catastrophic. I'm not saying it's not bad, but just I think most people think about it as, you know, weather, right? And weather isn't the same as a planet warming. So anyway, I just wanted to link 2 things that you said. One, you mentioned, Rodrigo, at the beginning, how many billion tons of carbon we have left, right? And you said 40 a year, right? I just want to be clear that in the counting of carbon, no military emissions and war emissions are included, thanks to the US, right? That is left off. So just if you look at military emissions without war, the US is military emissions make it the 5th biggest country in terms of emissions globally. Like, it's absolutely what, and so never mind that, right? And so that's not included, and never mind the war. And I just think, to bring back to Palestine and the genocide that's going on, being committed by Israel, like some of the reporting I've done this year has been looking at the climate impact, right? And that is not to take away from the direct impact of people, your killing of people. But, you know, I interviewed the Palestinian climate minister at COP last year, and so this was just after Israel's war on Gaza started, and she said to me, before this, the biggest existential threat facing Palestinian people was the climate crisis, right? And now the huge amount of greenhouse gases that have been emitted, and what reconstruction will lead to, one thing. And secondly, when we talk about an arms embargo, we have to talk about a fossil fuels embargo to Israel, right? Because, you know, even since the ICJ ruling on the plausible cause of genocide, the US has continued to send jet fuel for the military planes. Many countries, including Brazil, including Italy more recently, including several African countries, and Russia, Azerbaijan have been, Kazakhstan have been sending oil and oil products to Israel. And all of these companies, Chevron, Exxon, and so these are, under international law, these countries should be held culpable for their role in genocide. So these things are absolutely connected, right? You can't, when I talk about or try to connect the dots geographically, it's also about these issues, right? Israel cannot continue its campaign of genocide without fossil fuels. It just can't do that. And so these are deeply connected. I just wanted to make that.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Nina. Last but not least, Alice, who I'm wondering, these are excerpts from an excellent interview that you did with The Nation. I recommend all of you reading it. I just want to read a couple of things. Thank you. One is, I'm going to read it for you so you don't have to read it yourself. Yeah, but these are her words. Put your money where your mouth is, or rather, take your money out of fossil fuels. Because at the end of the day, you can't continue hiding behind various commitments, fancily worded net zero pledges, blah, blah, blah. Citibank is the largest funder of new fossil fuel expansion since 2015. It's so interesting because, you know, we have been sort of dealing with, you have been through the Summer of Heat campaign, dealing with Citibank, and, you know, and we looked at their comms campaign, at sort of their messaging. You know, their CEO is like, I think that there's like she's been trying to sort of market herself as like the CEO of generosity or something like that. You know, and they really try to sort of create this image of like a progressive bank that really cares about climate. So I'm wondering if we can first talk about Summer of Heat, you know, the accomplishments of the campaign, what the campaign was, and then talk about, you know, the sort of greenwashing that you're seeing, and sort of, you know, and how, you know, you confront that, and the importance of confronting that.
Yeah, of course. So the Summer of Heat campaign has been a campaign of sustained nonviolent civil disobedience on the biggest financiers, the banks, the asset managers, and the insurers that are really behind enabling the fossil fuels' continued sort of destruction of the planet. And, you know, we had 13 weeks of nonstop sustained civil disobedience against many of these institutions, but most particularly Citigroup, which we identified as an incredibly sort of compelling target, not only because they are the world's largest funder of new fossil fuel expansion out of all the banks in the world since the Paris Agreement, but also because of this public sort of PR image that they fashioned for themselves, you know. And I think, you know, we saw there to be a ripe terrain for struggle against Citibank because, you know, when you fashion yourself in that manner, when you try to rest your reputation, rest your sort of ability to recruit new talent and retain talent on that kind of progressive greenwashed reputation, it makes it even more powerful for us to be able to shatter their reputation, right, and to damage their brand reputation, which we know to be a potent tactic against the banks and against corporations in general when you're waging a corporate campaign. So that's just a little bit about the overview of the Summer of Heat. In total, we had 700 people, 700 arrests take place throughout the summer, the vast majority of which were in front of the global headquarters of Citigroup, which is in Tribeca. And we had about 5,000 people participate in total in one way or another, either coming to one march, one civil disobedience protest, or to, we had some folks, who I think probably went to 90% of the protests throughout the summer, which is just, obviously incredible. We had, by the end of the summer, we had 45 actions in total. So 45 actions over the course of 13 weeks. That's, more than 3 actions on average per week. I had to do some quick arithmetic there. I think, so that's just the overview of the campaign. The sort of origin story of the campaign was that, I was one of the, organizers of the March to End Fossil Fuels, along with, a tremendous, group of other organizers, and which was, we put 75,000 people on the streets of New York last September, about a year ago, actually. And, it felt kind of like a homecoming for the climate movement because as we all, I'm sure, remember back in 2019, right, September 2019, it really felt so powerful, like, just hundreds of thousands of people all over the, every single country, there seemed to be hundreds of thousands of people, led by young people, and I was living in Madrid at the time, and I remember the COP in Madrid that year, right? Like there was just this massive march throughout the streets of Madrid, and then we organized like weeks upon weeks during that conference of civil disobedience in front of the conference hall, and there were just people coming over, not only from all over Europe, but all over the world, right, who wanted to partake not just in the march, but in fact in the civil disobedience components of the protests. And so, many of us were geared up and all excited, March of 2020, April of 2020, we're going to come back even bigger. And of course, obviously, we all know that's not what actually ended up happening. And so, 75,000 people in comparison is very few people. But it felt very potent nonetheless because the March to End Fossil Fuels, it's in the name, the March to End Fossil Fuels. We were able to name directly the fossil fuel industry as the culprit, as opposed to the previous marches, which were all incredible efforts, but, had a broader tent, kind of like, we need to stop climate change. Rather this, we were very proud, of being able to say, a specific decision maker in the US's case, it was President Biden, although of course there were mobilizations across the world that had different targets. A specific target, President Biden had to actually take action to phase out fossil fuel expansion. And even that kind of much more narrow demand scope and messaging scope, drew a lot of people onto the streets. And so it was kind of like a exciting moment, and we were like, let's try to translate this energy that was generated through this broad-based march into a much more targeted, much more sustained, much more escalated campaign of civil disobedience, where people are getting arrested, blocking the doors of Citibank multiple times a week. By the end of the campaign, people were getting dragged away from the doors because they were refusing to move, even when the police came and tried to make arrests. And so that was kind of the maybe it's working now. Maybe it's working now. Anyway,
it is. Yeah.
Cool. And so that was the origin story of the campaign. And as the campaign grew, and as it sort of continues over the weeks, we started seeing heightened sort of repressive tactics from really from the NYPD, but really acting in concert with Citigroup itself, right? We would witness, Citigroup private security point at specific protesters in the crowd who they had identified as leaders of the campaign and say, get that guy. We had instances where somebody was actually walking, one of these protest leaders was walking away from the plaza actually where the protests take place. And one of the private security guards pointed at him, and he spent 7 hours in jail for no reason whatsoever, walking away from the doors. We had an instance. I'm looking at John Mark because he's one of the people in the audience. John Mark in the audience. He's one of the two where we had private security point two people out, claim falsely that they assaulted him. They had to spend over 12 hours in jail, and ultimately got a restraining order for those troubles. And obviously this is not, I'm not saying that these are the worst things that have ever happened to any protester, certainly not when you look at the global sort of perspective, but not even in the United States, of course. To contextualize these things, to kind of build off of what you were saying, Nina, to contextualize these things, it's just within a very common pattern of the state usually manifests through some local police department or something like that. The state sort of very much cooperating, the state, not only the local police department actually, but also, whatever set of prosecutors, right, might exist in whatever local judicial system, cooperating with a private corporation to kind of crack down on protesters, to crack down on protest movements. 3 years out from line 3, there are still people dealing with their various felony charges and legal troubles and organizations dealing with such issues. And that was a, clear example of, local sort of police departments actually being paid directly by the fossil fuel companies behind the pipeline, right? So it wasn't even some kind of like informal sort of or extra legal kind of like setup. It was in plain sight, supposedly fully legal, right? Kind of like set up. And, so in our case, right, you see the same example. In this case, it's not a fossil fuel company cooperating with, Minnesotan police, but it's Citigroup, sort of working, actively collaborating with the NYPD that just actively sort of goes along with it, and it's even down to the sort of relational dynamics here, right? Like most of Citigroup's private security are retired NYPD. It's very common for big corporations to employ private security guards that are actually just retired members of the police force. And so in our instance, some of the most egregious examples of individual security guards making false allegations against protesters, we know for a fact that they are retired police and that they have relationships with the people who are doing the arrests, the active police force. And so I just wanted to kind of give our anecdote about what happened this summer, to kind of to position it within this much broader trend, this highly troubling trend, obviously, as we've been saying tonight, of this sort of like pretty active and in many cases not even extrajudicial sort of collaboration between a private corporation, a powerful private corporation, and some local police force. And then, in our instance, none of these sort of trumped up arrests resulted in any kind of trial. But if it were to result in trial, right, there might be further sort of issues where there might be private collaboration between a sort of DA's office, for instance, with some private corporation, as you are seeing now with many of the sort of legal troubles that organizers and protesters are facing throughout the country, MVP, Line 3, and so on and so forth. So I think to take a step back here, right, like this is all very troubling. And we're speaking of how governments and these companies are all cooperating with each other, that there is very much a likelihood of this all getting worse in Western democracies. And certainly with the specter of, authoritarianism and, the ascent of far-right politics, it feels all the more likely and real. And I think to take a step back as an organizer, obviously you ask, like, what can we do about this? We're not just trying to diagnose the problem, but we're also trying to figure out what we as normal citizens who don't have a particularly big bank account or, special connections to really powerful people, what is it that we can do, right? And I'm an organizer, so obviously I wouldn't be remiss if I didn't say that I think one of the most important solutions is grassroots organizing. And the reason for that is because all of these things that we're saying, talking about these trends, the trends of rising emissions, the trends of rising repression, all of these things, they are not, they're not like some teleological trend. There is no sort of preordained destination for these trends. It is not a given at all that as emissions rise, just because emissions have been rising in the past, they necessarily must continue to rise, right? It is not necessarily the case that just because we're seeing this highly troubling case of rising repression in Western democracies, that necessarily has to continue being the case, right? And obviously throughout history, organizers have been able to build power and to allow, or rather ordinary people have built power for themselves so that they have been able to change the conditions of their lives, whether it's the economic conditions of their daily lives, the conditions at their workplace, or in our case, fighting the climate crisis, the conditions of our lives on this planet. And really that's at the core of what we do as climate organizers. We're trying to change the conditions of our lives on this planet, because for too long, those conditions have been entirely dictated by the fossil fuel industry and dictated by the funders and financiers that prop them up. And of course, ultimately the governments that set the policies that enable their continued operations and their business as usual. And so I think, just to, I guess, leave on a more optimistic note, because I don't think you could be an organizer and not have optimism, because you have to believe that you can actually change the course of history, and that, in fact, we have done so numerous times throughout history through the power of grassroots organizing. And so I think to just leave with, on a positive note, we all have the potential to be organizers, right? It doesn't take, in fact, I think, I think it's the easiest thing in the world. It's reaching out to your community and saying, are you also seeing how fucked up it is, like the way I'm seeing it? And I bet most of your friends are gonna be like, yeah, I think so. It's pretty messed up, everything that's happening, this climate change, rising authoritarianism, the fact that, the relatively small numbers of people who are currently taking action are getting cracked down. And the way that we can change this trend is by having many more people, obviously, take action. And unfortunately, I'm not a consummate organizer tonight because I don't have the next action to pitch you all to go do, which is normally what I would be doing. But, I think it's, I don't have that because I'm going on vacation in a week. But, but I think that, just to, it's really, we always talked about Summer of Heat as like a sort of example of like courage and ambition, right? We were kind of like, well, we've like sometimes shut down Citibank once, we've sometimes like done a civil disobedience protest like once in front of a place, or maybe sometimes for a week. Why don't we do it for 13 weeks straight? And really, when we talk about these lofty concepts like courage and ambition, when we talk about civil disobedience, when we talk about solidarity, all of these lofty sort of big ideas, what we're really saying is these are political expressions of love, right? It's the political expression of love. It's, there's many things that I love in this world, there's many people that I love in this world, and really I'm practicing this courage, and I'm trying to raise the levels of ambition here, as we all are in the climate movement, to be pushing more and pushing harder, because I'm trying to sort of practice my expression of political love. And so I think that's something that we all can be doing, because we all can be organizers, and we all can be building the movement of people who are willing to not accept the current sort of trends and to actually change the course of history. So.
Wow. Amazing. Thank you, Alice. I would like to open to the audience and see if any of you has any questions to our panelists, and I'll gladly bring the microphone to anyone. Yeah.
One second. Thank you, Kumi, for coming, by the way.
Yes, Kumi, thank you.
No, well, I want to congratulate him for the new job. Actually, for you, what's big? Actually, for you, what make you feel about you? So my question is, what make you feel? What make you filming in London, talking about the climate crisis and the flood that they had around this country. So even though that then So last year we have a smoke coming, and so last year we have a smoke coming from Canada. So can you tell us about what happened in wildfire last year in Canada, and how do we, and then we have the smoke coming from Canada here in the state. Can you tell us that?
Thank you.
I mean, we remember those orange skies, right? Even earlier this year, the air quality was really, really bad in the Midwest because the Canadian wildfire season started really early. The South Louisiana was having really bad air quality because there was wildfires in Mexico. I mean, I guess the one thing I would say is that the planet doesn't care where you burn fossil fuels, right? It doesn't matter. You know, the US is, what's the word? Its mantra is, we're extracting more gas and more oil than everyone else, but we're not burning them here, as if the planet cares where they're burnt, right? And in the same way that, you know, if there's a wildfire in Canada, it's not going to stay in Canada. You know, if there's the hotter oceans are making, you know, more intense hurricanes and floods and storms for everybody. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I don't know if that's answering your question, but it's, you know, the wildfires in Canada are, they're absolutely driven by the climate crisis. There are other conditions that are important in that, in terms of forest management and many other things, but we know that the wildfires in Canada, in the US, are made much more likely by the hotter planet, because you have less rain, you have less predictable rain, you have more, you have hotter temperatures, and the predictable thing about the climate crisis is that it's unpredictable, right? You know, you're not getting the same weather patterns as you were before, and that's what sort of, you know, that and the hot planet and the hot oceans are driving all of these extreme weathers. We've always had extreme weather, we've always had wildfires, but they are getting much more intense and much more destructive than they were ever before. I don't know, does that answer? I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's all I've got.
Thank you, Nina. One more here.
Can I just say one thing? Sorry. Quickly, just to that, specifically on wildfires, there are two examples that I think of. One in particular is Hawaii, where in Lahaina recently there were wildfires that essentially eradicated the entire historic district of Lahaina, and those were man-made fires that were, from what I understand, caused by electrical outages and dry brush that could have been completely avoided and were due to humans. And so because of the human aspect of that, that certainly, I think, goes into the climate crisis bucket that humans continue to fill. And on top of that, I remember recently reading about how Sudan is also burning, in that there are villages being razed to the ground by, I believe, RSF and other militias, and that also contributes not only to the devastation and death of humans, but also to the earth and the climate as well. And so, yeah, I just wanted to mention that as well.
Just to say about Lahaina, I'm glad you brought up Lahaina. I was there in February, 6 months after those wildfires, and I had been there and working with Indigenous farmers on food sovereignty a couple of years before. And so to see that fire, I mean, did the climate crisis contribute? Absolutely. But that fire wouldn't have happened if Hawaii hadn't been colonized, right? Because that was diverse, resistant vegetation that was replaced by monocrops, by sugar and pineapple plantations. What you've seen more recently is the diversion of water to tourism centres, to hotels, to resorts, etc. So, you know, there isn't, you know, so all of those things, so these things are interlinked, right? There's a mountain on Maui, which is the second wettest place on the planet, And literally just over the other mountainside, it's utter drought, and it's been in drought for several years now, right? And so these microclimates, mosquitoes are moving up the mountain, changing crops. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of, so that, colonialism, extractive industries, industrial agriculture, industrial tourism, all of those things contributed, like you're saying, as well as a climate crisis. So if climate crisis increases the risk of something, right? It's a risk multiplier, I guess, is a technical way to put it.
Yeah, I have thank you, by the way, for a wonderful panel. I have a quick question and kind of a hypothesis. The quick question is, how much of your theory of change or theories of change relies upon the state, relies upon getting eventually legislation or executive action that shuts down fossil fuels from governments, particularly the federal government of the US? So that's the quick question. The hypothesis is that that's never going to happen in the US because the state has been captured by fossil fuel corporations, the legislature, sections of the judiciary, and the only part of the state that hasn't been captured is actually juries, which is very good for us because we're doing illegal things, and direct action against pipelines and so on, even sabotage, will wind up in front of juries in counties where there are people who know about and believe in jury nullification. That's libertarians and kind of liberty-minded people, not our usual allies by any means. And so that's a different model of change, theory of change, that involves direct action, no hope of electoral or legislative victory, but involves actually shutting things down and getting away with it through the jury's power to set aside the law, which is the same power actually that got the Bundys and their friends acquitted for the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge standoff. That could be a model for us. For anybody who wants to take it on now.
Which is that the shuns, we need to know the shuns, which is legislation, regulation, litigation, and reputation. That's what companies fear, and I like your hypothesis a little bit because I love seeing big jury awards, but I don't think that's the solution because they can do away with jury trials tomorrow by legislation. They're not necessary in civil cases. There's no constitutional right to a jury trial in civil litigation. So there will be some big cases, but I do not. I think it is actually. No, I don't mean that you intend this, but I think it's a recipe for hopelessness to think that we cannot do politics, including through activism, protest, and other direct actions, organizing, et cetera, to end up with legislation and regulation. They're absolutely essential. We will not get there only through litigation. All these are important. They're all necessary. And without all of them, we have no chance.
I would just add to that I think litigation will play an important role. But I think in terms of legislation, my view is that, I think whether you're talking about the US or Honduras or Guatemala, the way I see the picture is that I feel that governments, politicians are the second tier of power. They govern thanks to the corporations, and they govern on their behalf. And whether that's about making laws that make taxes, for the tax laws, the regulations, etc. Right? So I think that's the legislation I'd be more interested in. In Guatemala, there was a UN-backed anti-impunity organization called the CICIG for about a decade. And the head of that, who was a Colombian prosecutor, Ivan Vasquez, when he was there, their role was to dismantle and prosecute the criminal structures that had formed during the Civil War. And what he said, and I think it holds absolutely true for this country, campaign financing is the original sin. Right? If we litigated and got rid of campaign financing, if we took away that link, the financial link between the people that govern and the people that are and the corporations and industries, whether it's fossil fuels, guns, industrial big ag or whatever, that to me would be like, that is the original, that is getting to the root cause of it, And I think because, laws, all legislation is important, like in all, but I think you're often, until you deal with that, which I believe it is an original sin in terms of when you look at the structural corruption and impunity that comes after that, whatever area you're talking about, that to me would be like, the key focus. And if you look at the, people like the Heritage Foundation and the Federal Society and, Project 2025, this has been a 4 or 5 decade long plan to go after voting rights and to dismantle regulation, etc. And they've done it through campaign financing by actually making campaign financing opaque and really have a huge influence on American politics. But I mean, I could be talking about many other countries too,
Thank you so much. This has been a really, really wonderful panel. Hi, Alice. I am an organizer here in New York City. I organize with Fridays for Future USA, and I went to the last COP, and obviously it was my first COP, and I was really debilitated. And so when we talk about the theories of change, of like changing the state and the people holding the state accountable, I really believe in that. At least in our countries, But when we talk about maybe the UN space and the UNFCCC space, how effective will it actually be if we manage to hold the UNFCCC accountable, if we manage to put in place comprehensive conflict of interest policies that are binding? So I guess my question is, if we were to do that, do you think it would be, possible to enact more international binding laws and treaties?
I mean, it would definitely help, right? I mean, we only, it's only been the last couple of years where when you apply for your accreditation, there is a question that says, are you representing somebody else, right? That's the only reason that we know that almost 5,000 fossil fuel lobbyists were there last year, plus all the other lobbyists working for big ag, false solutions like carbon capture, et cetera, all of those things. And it's not just that. Some countries actually on their official negotiating delegations have chief executives of fossil fuel companies on there. Do you know what I mean? They're not just walking these corridors of power, they're at the negotiating table. So of course it would absolutely help to do that. Do you know what I mean? But I think, there are many of, again, it's like one part of, yes, I mean, it's ridiculous that they're there. They should not be there at all. But it's also, that space is meant to be, it's the only place when it comes to climate that every single country, state has a seat at the table. Is the power distribution equal? Absolutely not. The US goes with 500 people and they bully other countries all of the time to get the votes that they want. You talk to, a country like, let's say, I don't know, I'm making this up slightly, but like say, Somalia, right, incredibly vulnerable and being impacted by the climate crisis right now, probably has a delegation of about 20 people, right? You also have, through the US's bilateral trade agreements and aid agreements, it has the Pacific Island states, which are among the most vulnerable in the world, are often the ones to veto or not, some of them veto or not vote for climate action. Because they're bullied by the US, it's like, well, they get these calls and it's like, well, that $5 million that we promised you for this, that's not going to come if you vote for that. So it's also like, and actually in the negotiating room, so this is like getting into the weeds slightly, you're meant to go in with your official negotiator, so that's been John Kerry for many years, right? And one expert advisor. That's the rules. The US just ignores them and goes in with 10 other people. And no one can do anything about it, right? And so that is another thing. So it's like, yes, obviously the fossil fuel and all the other big industries have to be out. It is the idea that they need to be part of a solution is complete and utter crap, right? Because why would it just obviously isn't going to work, right? It's not working. They have no interest in changing at all. But it's not just that. I think, do you know what I mean? Like the international system, the UN system, which is about diplomacy and it's about consensus, has so many limitations. It's the only thing we've got. Some years I just think, why are we all? It's like become like a why are we here? What a complete and utter waste of time. Do you know what I mean? And then other times I think, well, what else have we got, right? And last year we did achieve, there was an achievement of the Loss and Damage Fund that, you know, developing countries and island states have been talking about and demanding for 20 years. Do you know what I mean? Like, and that mechanism now exists. So, but the change, I mean, is the change fast in us? Absolutely not. Like, absolutely not. But so I think it, but again, it has to be multiple things. Do you know what I mean? It's not just one.
And just quickly to that too, in international bodies like the UN, there are also non-legally binding declarations. And so there could be some kind of, you know, legislation or you know, resolution that says we have to have these conflict of interest regulations, we have to have these kinds of, you know, prerequisites before you get into some kind of engagement. But if it's not legally binding, it practically is null. So while that is a very, you know, prominent institution, it has no teeth sometimes. And so, yeah, to what you were saying, direct action gets the goods. You know, if we do what we need to do in order to change the system, then the laws don't necessarily have to matter, because we would have organized successfully enough to get the change that we are requiring by, for example, like taking over government buildings. But that's a whole different conversation, and I'm not going to touch that right now.
Thank you, Marcello. We have time for one last question. I'm going to go to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. My name is Matthew with Extinction Rebellion, New York City. I just want to celebrate Summer of Heat and Alice Who, and it's just been really great for our city, this big mobilization. I like to sometimes describe us as like protest producers. You know, we have lights, camera, finance, arts department, and actors, activists come in, and then we yell action. And we're trying to make the headlines for you. And so I just wanted to ask you, it seems like the road is going to be rough. It's going to get harder. That's what Mr. Naidu is signaling with the news from the rest of the world. And I'm not surprised. I think sometimes the general American zeitgeist is this kind of shock. Oh, how could they arrest such and such? And it's like, well, yeah, you're going after the government, so of course they're going to arrest you. Joanna Smith, I was there at the sentencing hearing, and it's this really it's horrible to watch, I will say. And this sometimes in this work, it's horrible to watch your Reds going in, and you know they're going to get brutalized, and you know they might not get covered on the news. And you've been up for 40 hours to try and make it happen, and you're going for it. So I just wanted to ask you all, particularly you, Mr. Adams, like, what type of disruptions in 2025 do you think would perhaps benefit this platform, benefit this legal fight? Because we have a lot of folks calling on the phone that want to jump in, that want to get out there, that want to fight for their planet. And our responsibility is really to decide like where they're going to have the most impact, where they're going to be the safest so that they can last through multiple disruptions, and what is actually going to maybe turn the attention and get more recruits and more outreach, more press. So I'm just curious about, as you, to a young climate activist, protest producer, what type of stories do you want to see that would potentially benefit this bigger global discussion around criminalization of climate activism? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Great question. I would echo, because Kumi and I have talked about this a lot. We never know what's going to catch fire. No, if we knew that, we would do it, and we would do it over and over again. And we don't know when the media is going to grab something. We don't know why often they grab things. But since I like your framing, you know, this is a production. You may have heard of the group called Mothers Rise Up. They've done these really great actions in front of Lloyd's of London in the UK. I do think having some kind of positive message as well as confronting people with a stark reality is really important. And that positivity can be, you know, describing how we have a better future, or it can be making people laugh while they also take this subject seriously. or the musicality of Mother Rise Up kind of actions, or the fact that the way that children are involved and seem to be in a kind of in the front of it, not just being used as props, I think can be very effective. But it's it's way beyond my competence to suggest like what action would work. I will say this though, that you brought up the cop, and one elephant in the room that we haven't mentioned is China. Everything you said about what the U.S. is doing, they're doing as well, and they're getting better at it and maybe even more effective. But China, the United States, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, none of them want to sign something that says phase out of fossil fuels. And so my way of leaving everybody with some hope is that the only reason they're doing this is because of all this activism, because they know that they need to show something to the public around the world that is demanding some kind of action. They have no other motivation. I've thought about this a lot. Why the hell would Saudi sign up to something that said phase out fossil fuel? Well, of course, it's weasel language. It's not really strong and not enforceable. But it was a precedent that they fought forever against. Even the Saudis are susceptible to public opprobrium around the world. And so we're making progress, and it's like almost everything that has a political, that's related to politics, you never know when you're going to succeed until you succeed. I've just come back from Bangladesh. It's kind of off topic, but they had a dictatorship for the last 15 years. I've worked on Bangladesh for years. And if you said 3 months ago that their dictator, Sheikh Hasina, would be out of power today, you wouldn't have found 1% of Bangladeshis who would have said that was possible. She's gone. So basically, we keep fighting. We keep fighting over and over again, trying to be as creative as possible, smart as possible, head and heart, every tool in the box. And if you can't do this kind of work unless you think there's a chance, and we keep fighting. And so use your creativity and do things that are different, and don't be afraid to fail. We fail more than we win in the human rights and climate movement. We keep trying different things, and we can't fear failure. Try things, doesn't work, try something else.
And just to that point, because I really appreciate your work in Bangladesh, and wanted to just clarify in case folks don't know, there was a dictator in Bangladesh, and the student movement rose up a couple of months ago and ousted her in their extreme passion and populist movement that essentially caused her to flee the country and then resign. And so if protests didn't work, then they wouldn't be repressing us. And if they really were confident that this kind of paradigm of like fossil fuels was going to get us into the future, then they wouldn't be arresting us and they wouldn't be trying to silence us and censor us. And so the fact that, like you mentioned, we have to be willing to fail in order for us to win is one of the, I think, optimistic ways of framing it, because we know that we also can win, and we know that we also have the people on our side, and generally speaking, we are on the right side of history. And so knowing that, I think, helps give ourselves some fuel to continue that fire. So keep at it.
I know we're way over time, but I also just wanted to say one more dynamic, which is not just that, when there's repression, we hold on to our hope. There's actually also a strategic element here, right? Where oftentimes when there is repression, there's actually a tremendous organizing opportunity to use and leverage that repression, right? Because when previously a protest movement may have been popular among the committed activists, among the existing activist community, but often it is actually through extremely violent or just unreasonable repression that actually makes the broader public, the general public, actually wake up and notice notice that these protests are happening, and notice, the issue that the protesters are trying to raise. And, Bangladesh, like the uprisings in Bangladesh, like many, sort of popular uprisings in the past 15 years that we've seen across the world, it started with like some group of people that wants to occupy, for example, in New York City, occupy a plaza, right? Occupy a park, right? Or, take to the streets, and there's a tremendous government backlash, right, in Bangladesh. That certainly happened against a lot of the student leaders, right, really brutal, violent, repressive sort of jailings, beatings, etc. And that actually, sort of creates the conditions and creates the opportunities for many, many more people to suddenly get galvanized and go onto those streets. And that's exactly what happened, in this country as well, right? For example, with Occupy Wall Street. So I think that there's both the sort of like, we need to keep fighting through the repression because that's the only thing we've got in our arsenal. But it's also that like when these repressive tactics happen, they're actually an opportunity for us, those who are already committed to this cause, right, to actually be able to get the cause to grow bigger. And so there's always the strategic element as well that I'm thinking of as an organizer, and that I think is often a very common dynamic throughout the past 15 years of street protest.
To say one thing, I'm sorry, everyone wants to go. Just to say, in Bangladesh, I mean, the new prime minister is a former student leader, so that's like an amazing story, right? I just wanted to say, in terms of hope, it is something I really struggle with, and I'm not an organizer. I'm a journalist, but I wanted to just, we haven't had time to talk about Bata Casares, who was an amazing Indigenous leader who won the Goldman Prize for for her work leading a campaign against internationally funded dam in Honduras, and she was murdered less than a year later. Oh yeah, available here.
An amazing book.
Yeah. But I wanted something that she honestly, like the man, I met her only once. I interviewed her when she was on the lam because she was being criminalized. She had trumped up charges against her, and she was sleeping in different places every night, right, trying to avoid arrest. And and to me, what I learned from doing this book was that killing her was like the grand finale, right? They tried everything else to silence her, to neutralize her. When that didn't work, they killed her, right? So what the positive thing I want to say is that she always said, Nina, joy is an act of resistance, right? In amongst all of this, when I was covering the protests when you got arrested, for breaking the injunction, that there was joy there, right? And I think that actually I really struggle with it, especially this year, watching a genocide unfold and feeling so impotent. But she lived by that, right? She was, I remember her saying to me when I interviewed her, whatever I do to take care of myself, when they want to kill me, they're going to kill me. And they did. But she lived her daily life with joy. And I think that to me is what resistance is about, right? So that's me trying to be hopeful.
Wow, amazing. Great ending. Thank you, Nina, Alice, Brad, Marcello. One round of applause for them, because it's amazing that people came. Thank you.